Some thing. This is the second day of the Pint of Science Festival 22, and we have the umbrella is RGB, idea from our lovely Lavinia Oslo City Painter. Welcome. So I will just present what is the concept behind Pint of Science. So,
yes.
Yeah. We have some
working.
technical issue. Nice question. We will manage. So, Pint of Science is a worldwide festival. So it's present now in more than 30 countries, and the goal is like 3 days of sharing science with the broad audience, and in bars or cafe. And it is organized by volunteers, and we bring engaging researchers to come to speak with you. And Barney, that you can see here, this is a mascot. So you might have seen him with like some, under the handmade
3D.
by someone from Simula. I won't say the name, can I? So it's done by himself sitting here at the Simula table. I will just sit here. So, Pint of Science is born in 2012, so it's the 10th. It's the 10th edition in UK this year. And in Norway, we were born 2.5 years ago, so this is the third edition. The two first were online, so this is the first in person. I'm very proud of that. And this year, for the P22, we have 25 countries. We are present on we don't have the final number of cities, but I think it's more than 200, and yeah, it will be a lot of events. And you may have seen there's a boom on social media, a lot of posts with the hashtag P22. It's very nice. In Oslo, we represent 5 cities. So we have the northernmost events in Tromsø, then we have Trondheim, Bergen, Stavanger, and Oslo. We are present in every social media, or we try to, and actually we are as well the website that you have seen. So peterscience.no, and if you have any questions, there's a mistake on the email address. It's now at peterscience.com. I changed it.
Cool.
Oh, nice to put up.
Thank you. So I am Lavinia. I'm the coordinator of the team operating in Oslo. And first of all, as Thibault said, everything here has been organized by the team. Everyone working here in the team is a volunteer. So we do all of this in our free time, in our spare time. And we're really engaged in science communication, and we really want to thank you to be here tonight, because it was a lot of work to organize all of this. And I really need to thank all the volunteers that are here, and they worked a lot to make it possible tonight. But not only the volunteers, of course, also our speakers, because we know that creating a presentation for an event like this is difficult. It's very difficult. It's probably more difficult than prepare an ordinary presentation. So we're really grateful to the speakers that accepted our invitation to be part of this event for Pint 22. But again, not only the volunteers, not only the speakers, but of course our sponsors, because if we can do all of this, is also thanks to our sponsors. Simula is one of our one of the supporting, let's say, institution since the beginning of Pint of Science Norway, so from 2020 actually. So this is the 3rd year. NMBU is another of our sponsors this year, and we're always supported also by committees. And before leaving the floor to Simula to present very quickly the lab, I would ask you to send us, please come. To send us your feedback, because this is very important for us to improve every year, to try to make it better. And of course, we always need new volunteers. So if you want to be part of the team, if you want to do something for science communication, please join us. We are always happy to have new people in the team. Now, yes.
Thanks for choosing us over our vision.
Yes, that's also a revision tonight. As I said, one of our sponsors is the Simula, so I'm happy to give the floor. Yes? Kimberly? Yes, please. To present Simula. We're almost ready with the presentation, please. Oh, I give you also this one. It's for the streaming. Okay.
All right, hi everyone. My name is Kim, and I'm speaking on behalf of Simula Research Laboratory today. Simula has been a proud sponsor of Pint of Science Norway since it began in 2020. That's largely thanks to Ilse, who was an organizer until very recently of these events. Oh. No worries.
Yeah, so people here were saying what we are saying, so perfect. But people online, they were saying like, the next slide and everything. So no surprise for them.
Yeah, we gotta keep things interesting. So.
Yeah.
Where's my manager?
But it's
Yes.
fine.
We can do it this way.
Now.
That's
Yes.
fine.
I said I wanted to do.
Yes, perfect. No.
Okay. Super.
I hope it works. We have some issue with the computer as well. It's bad. It works.
Yeah. Okay, so Simula's vision is to be an excellent research lab solving important and fundamental problems of science and engineering, training highly qualified experts and leaders, and developing commercial enterprises. Now it won't work. So in general, focus is in research, and we specialize in 5 areas of research across 3 different campuses. One just down the street at Christian August Gate 23, one at Oslo Metropolitan University, and one over in Bergen. We also focus on education, and at any given time, we have about 50 each of master's students, PhD students, and postdocs. And thirdly, we have innovation. So we have an incubator for tech entrepreneurs. We're an investor in tech startups, and we do some consulting in deep tech R&D. So to go a little bit into the research areas that we have at Simula, one of the areas of focus is in machine learning. For this, we work using methods such as neural networks and deep learning algorithms toward applications like the one in the bottom right here that you see, where machine learning algorithms are used in detection for cancer screening. We also have a research area in communication systems. So some of the things that are currently being worked on there are 5G infrastructure and the Internet of Things, as well as sensor networks for things like self-driving cars. And a third area of research that we have, which is the one I'm most closely associated with, is in scientific computing. The main focus there is in biomedical modeling, so looking at things like fluid flows in the brain, as well as multi-scale models of cardiac cells and tissues, both the mechanics and the electrophysiology. In addition to sponsoring Pint of Science Norway, we're also a proud sponsor of the International Mathematical Olympiad, which is coming up this July. So that's going to bring together 600 high school students from around the globe to compete in a mathematics competition. So the reason that we sponsor events like this and like the Math Olympiad are that our mission is to solve important problems of science and engineering. And so we're always looking to inspire future generations of scientists and perhaps to get more people involved in our research. If you're interested in the research activities of Simula or potential careers, you can find us at simula.no or come and talk to me. That's it from me. So we'll go to the real program now, but thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Carmen. And so now, before the first presentation, we are going to have a quiz. So you can play with us. The quiz will be managed by Dana, is one of our volunteers, while the rest of the night will be chaired by Lourdes, another of our volunteers in the team. That is also, together with Judita, the one who created the quiz of the 3 nights. So thank you very much for your work.
You can say that they go to and oh yeah.
So, hi everybody. So, we want to start with a quiz. And the first thing to do is to get your phone and go to menti.com. Everybody? And there's a code on the top. So, please, we will wait for you. There's a prize for the winners. So, yeah. Is everybody ready? No? Okay, sorry. Okay, I will give you more time. Tick tock, tick tock. So we have 25, 26. Yeah. Ready? Sorry? Ah, okay. So if you are online, you can also. No. Yes, everybody's ready here. So we can start with the first question.
And they.
What? No. Some problem, sorry. They're coming. Yes, okay. So, the first question, what is highlighted in this picture? The rainforest, a tundra, or a desert? So, you have 10 seconds. 9. Yeah. Almost there. Yeah. Let's see. Okay. There is rainforest. Yes. Yes. And okay. Frosty is. Ah! Well, we know who is Frosty. Okay. Let's go. Second question. Yeah. In greenwashing a good approach for the environment? Yes or no? What do you think? 8 seconds. Well, it seems that it's a no, so. And now. Sorry, Frosty. Now we have Bram. Bram. Okay. Next question. Oh, sorry. Yes. How much of the rainforest is still intact? 25%, 36%, or 48%? And the question is, the answer is 36%. And let's see who is in the first spot. Nick, who is Nick? Question number 4. It is an example for greenwashing. Compensating CO emission, use of recycled materials, or distracting customers. Oh, yeah. So let's see what's the answer. Yes. 2 seconds, 1 second. And okay. 16 were right. And now, who is moving to the first spot? Tick, 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 tick. Hola, Hope. That table, there's something happening there. Oh, yes, it's good. Question number 5. Which rainforest represent nearly 50% of the total tropical rainforest? We have the Amazon rainforest, the Congo rainforest, and the Southeast Asian rainforest. So, dun, 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 dun. Yes. Yes. Only one person didn't get it right, but it's okay. And who is moving to the first spot? Oh, still Olejo. Yeah. Question number 6. What is the green investment? What is a green investment? Invest into environmental friendly business practice, personal purchase of environmental friendly products, or planting trees for compensating CO emissions. 1 second. Yeah. Okay, many people get it right. Oh. Still? Oh no! Oh. Who is Adela? Okay, then there's something. Question number 7. When did humans settle in the Amazon? I don't know. Like 5,000 to 8,000 years ago, 18 to 22,000, or 32 to 39,000 years ago. Tick, 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 tick. Okay, 5 people get it right. Madre. Still, Adela is on the first spot. Question number 8. It is an example for a green investment. I think that we have something already.
It's the new one.
Also, oh, sorry. Renewable energy, the moon, or a bike? Yeah. Let's see what's the answer. Yeah. Okay. And now, I think that Adela is still there. Yeah. Okay. Almost there. This is the question number 9. Indigenous people form about 26% of the total population of Peru. Which one is not an indigenous community in Peru? Wambisa, Hispanic, or Shipibo? Shipibo. Yeah. Yes, I'm happy that you have it correct. Okay. Yeah, Adele is still in the first spot. And we have the last question. Question number 10. CICERO is a research center in Norway doing climate research. What are their shades of green? Light, medium, dark. Scale for contribution of an activity technology to low carbon future or forest type. And 3, 2, 1. Let's see who is going to win this.
Oh,
What happened? Why is there so many O? Okay. And the winner Adela. Yes. So, sorry? Okay, so Adela, could you come here? So because we have something for you. Adela, can you just come? Oh, well, we can go to you. We have a small present for you. Okay, that's all for me. Now, yeah. No, este abajo. Ah.
No.
Maybe I don't know. Okay, so hi guys. We would like to welcome the very first speaker. So I would like to ask Julio to come here, please.
Okay, so please welcome Julia with a big applause. Okay, before she presents her very nice work, I would like to introduce her. So, Julia Naime, she's a researcher at NMBU. She was born and raised in the urban jungle of Mexico City. Julia fell in love with the rainforest when she visited it for the very first time in Chiapas as a biology student. Also trained as an economist, Julia is now conducting research on the linkage between economic growth and deforestation and evaluating the relative effectiveness of conservation policies when implemented in different socioeconomic contexts. Before starting with her PhD, Julia was coordinating research focused on REDD+, agriculture, and provision of ecosystem services. Although she comes from warm and sunny Mexico, she does like snowy winters and visiting Norwegian mountains pretty much any time of the year. So please welcome Julia with an applause.
Should I move it? Okay, so I don't move it. Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you for the nice introduction. And thank you for the organizers for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here and present a little bit about my research and the topic that I work on in a nice social setting. Can you all hear me well? Yeah, okay. Okay, so I'll just start. So I'll talk today about the title of the presentation is Natural Capital and Deforestation. And so I recently finished my PhD. And my topic was on drivers of deforestation and policies to reduce deforestation. So I'm not going to talk specifically of my PhD research, but I do want to explain the importance of the topic and the relevance of worrying about deforestation. So I'm just starting with a very brief history of humans on Earth. So Homo sapiens have been on Earth approximately for 300,000 years. I'm not an anthropologist, so approximate number. And since then, we have had a lot of progress and improvements in our standards of living. So we started very basic, just hunter-gatherers, basic tools, all shelters with caves or very basic infrastructure. And with our skills and knowledge, we have been able to transform our environment and improve significantly our standards of living and transform our Earth in significant ways. But this increase in our standards of living, economic growth, has also led to some problems. So we see a lot of pollution, be it water pollution, air pollution. There's also unsustainable extraction, and this can be from renewable resources such as fish or forests, timber. And there's also extraction of non-renewable resources, such as oil or coal. So the difference is really the time of regeneration of the resources. And when we extract it unsustainably, this leads also to pollution and to degradation of our natural capital, which is the topic of the talk. So in general, we see that this positive relationship between environmental impact and income levels. So as GDP per capita increases, we also see an increase in our ecological footprint. If we measure it in hectares per person. And this is also true of our carbon footprint. So in general, countries with higher income have higher CO2 emission based on consumption. And countries with from the global south, so with lower income levels, Latin America, Africa, Southeast Asia, have lower emissions. So where does economics come into this picture? So really, economics is all about sustainability. It should be all about sustainability. So the word, and maybe the ones who come from social sciences already know this, but the word comes from two Greek words, so eco, that means home, and we also find it in ecology, for example, and nomos, which means accounts. So it's really about managing our home, in this case, the earth. And the questions that we try to answer is, for example, understand how we produce the goods and services that increase our standards of living, So how do we achieve economic growth? Another type of question that we try to answer is how can we best manage our natural resources or our resources in general so that we decrease the cost. So we have higher benefits with the least cost, including social and environmental. So traditionally, economists have explained economic growth with considering distinguishing between flows and stocks. So making the distinction between the capital that we have. So these are our assets, durable goods that we can transform to produce goods and services. And the first theories of economic growth consider two main types of assets or capital. So the produced capital, so this is roads, building, machines that we use to transform our environment. So this is basic infrastructure or physical infrastructure. And the second main type of capital is human capital. So this is our labor. And it includes conditions such as health. So if we have good health, we can work, we can produce. And it also includes education. So if we have skills, if we have knowledge, we can innovate, we can create more goods and services, perhaps be more productive and effective with our resources. And then this changes a lot across societies. And I mean, this has changed over time. This has changed also changes across countries. So the human capital will be different in different locations, but it considers, it could be factory workers, the architects, the scientists, and of course the doctors, which are also part of the health component. So what about natural capital? So this is one type of capital that has been forgotten and disregarded by economists, but that we have tended to include better in our models and include them in our, to explain how we can achieve sustainability. So it's a basic type of capital that we would consider well, it's very intuitive to include it, but it was not, it has not always been included and considered. So I've talked about renewable and non-renewable resources, and this is what we consider part of our natural capital. And so it's these three types of capital that are assets that we can use and transform to produce the goods and services to have economic growth. So how have the types of capital evolved in recent decades? So we see that produced capital and human capital, and this is at the global level, produced capital has increased, human capital has increased as well, but we see a decrease in natural capital. And this, again, natural capital is going to include our non-renewable resources, such as mineral, fossil fuels, but also our renewable resources, such as forests, timber, and fisheries. So being very skeptic, we could think, so why should we care about the fact that we're losing our natural capital? And here, there's basically two ways to think about the economy. So we can think of the economy and the earth, such in a cowboy economy setting. And then the other way to think is about the spaceship economy. So in the cowboy economy, we can think about weak sustainability. So this means that we're going to be able to replace our natural, if we're losing our natural capital, we're going to be able to replace it with our produce and our produced capital and with our human capital. And this is something that might seem intuitive. For example, if we think of agricultural production, to have 10 tons of wheat, we might need 10 hectares. But if we have fertilizers, we might just need 5. So our fertilizer, the produced capital, is replacing for this natural capital, which is land. In the spaceship economy, that's another approach. And it would, in this one, we would think we cannot replace our natural capital with other forms of capital. And what I want to show is that, of course, whether we are in a cowboy economy or in a spaceship economy will depend on whatever we're analyzing. There is some substitutability between the types of capital, but I'm gonna talk about forests. I'm gonna try to argue that we should have an approach that is more akin to the strong sustainability definition. So the key question to be able to distinguish between those two types of economies is, can we replace our natural capital with a produced capital? So as I've tried to argue, it's an empirical question, but it's also a normative one. So the empirical part is like the information that we produce and how we analyze changes in types of capital over time can give us the answers of how much we can reproduce one type of capital for the other. But it's also a question of normative. It's also a normative question depending on how we value the natural capital. So things such as studying what drives technological change is very important to be able to make this distinction between the cowboy economy and the spaceship economy. Also the existence of tipping points. So we've heard about that. If we emit too much CO2, we're gonna exceed some levels of, the levels of emission are going to be too much and we're going to have more catastrophic events. And then we have the values and norms. So the values and norms, those are like the decisions that guide our management, the management of our natural resources. So talking about forests, so why are forests important as natural capital? So they comprise 30% of the Earth's surface. And they are defined as, they can be an area as small as 0.5 hectares, with trees higher than 5 meters, and a canopy cover of more than 10%. So the deforestation is the loss of forest cover at the expense of other land uses, such as an urban expansion or agricultural expansion. So what benefits do we receive from forests? So there's basically 4 types of ecosystem services. So we have supporting, provisioning, regulating, and cultural. So supporting are really the basic functions that allow the provision of the other ecosystem services. So we have nutrient cycling, so soil formation and primary production, so just biomass production. Then we have provisioning, so we have food, fresh water, wood and fiber, fuel such as firewood. Then we have regulating ecosystem services, so this is considering, for example, carbon capture and storage. We have flood regulation, so forests capture a lot of water. Disease regulation, water purification, and we also have the cultural ecosystem services, such as the recreational values of forests, spiritual values of forest. So the forest, in particular rainforests, provide a range of ecosystem services, and they impact actors at the local level to the global. And these are the changes in forest cover since 1982. So we see some heterogeneity across the world. So in the north, the forest cover has actually increased. But in the tropical areas, we see that there has been a lot of forest loss. And so deforestation is mostly concentrated in the tropics. So in the last few years, we have not been able to reduce the amount of deforestation. And these are emissions that are very significant and cannot be underestimated. So for example, in 2020, the tropics, we lost 12.2 million hectares, and this results in the emissions of 570 million cars, which is double the size of the amount of cars we have there's in the US, so it's a significant amount of emissions. And what is the main driver of this forest cover loss? It's agricultural expansion. So in the red areas, we see it's commodity-driven deforestation. So for example, palm oil, cattle, soy, and yellow is shifting agriculture, which could be related to smallholder agriculture. And in the green areas, this is related to forestry. So this is just the rotational process in many plantations in North America and Europe. So this agriculture, especially if we think of the tropical areas, is a source of economic growth that is needed by the rural poor. that live in those tropical areas. So this is just some statistics worldwide. So we see that the extreme poor and the moderate poor, they are mostly rural. And on the right-hand side, we see that those extreme poor and moderate poor, they are basically, most of them live off of agricultural activities. So the question of reducing deforestation is also a question of how to find alternative livelihoods for the rural poor. So it's a question of economic growth. So going back again to this distinction between the cowboy economy and the spaceship economy. So I want to argue that we have to have this strong sustainability approach to deforestation. So tropical forests, they host irrecoverable carbon. So if we lose it, we're not going to be able to recover it by mid-century. So what we see here is the irrecoverable carbon. And we see that most of it is in tropical areas. And the Amazon is also at the, so it's, scientists start pointing out that there's a tipping point as well in the Amazon. So again, pointing to the spaceship economy where we're not going to have this substitutability between types of capital. And that because the Amazon rainforest is self-regulating, so it's creating its own climate that it needs to survive. If we lose enough, there's going to be Amazon dieback. The other important reason is that reducing deforestation is an important source of emissions. So reducing it is going to be important to meet our climate change goals, climate change mitigation goals. And it is estimated that they can provide up to 32% of the solution that we need to, of the mitigation we need by 2030. So I'm trying to argue that we can think of deforestation as this negative externality. So forests are providing global services to society as a whole, and they are undervalued as compared to the agricultural land. When we lose the forest, there are some actors that benefit. So we talked about the rural poor who need to transform forests to obtain agricultural income, but society at large is losing. So then conserving this forest becomes an environmental, but also a distributional problem. So can we find ways to compensate the poor living near the forest to conserve, because these forests are providing global benefits? So internationally, there's a lot of cooperation efforts to reduce deforestation. So in the last COP, 137 countries committed to collectively end forest land and degradation. The question is how to do it and finding the right political incentives so that we can implement effective policies. But also the amount of funding has increased compared to previous years. So I want to end with wrapping up about how we can think of forest and nature in general. So I've argued that there's three things we need to consider to make this distinction between cowboy economy and the spaceship economy. So the substitutability between the types of capital, tipping points, technological change, and values and norms are also important. So we can think of a forest and nature as being substitutable, so we can change natural capital for produced or human capital. And it is only valuable to the extent that it can be used and consumed. So managing our natural capital is only a matter of, it's only a management question. But if we think of nature with an intrinsic value, then it becomes irreplaceable. It has historical evolutionary importance, and conserving it is also an ethical problem, not only an economic problem. And that's it.
Thank you very much. That was a really wonderful presentation. So I would, Juli, come. I would like to see if there's any questions for her. I know I have some, but if anybody else has some questions, so let me see if I can get all the way there. Yes. Here. I can't move anymore.
So
So I was really interested at the end of your talk, great talk by the way, when you were discussing this idea of compensation for conservation. Are there ways to quantify sort of the value of a certain amount of land that might help to motivate governments or companies to take that approach?
Yeah. So it's a big topic. I think the key question of properly compensating and avoiding the greenwashing that we can see sometimes in carbon offsets is having good baselines and reference levels. But that is it's easy to do ex post. So try to think about this is what would have happened without the policy, but it's difficult to predict it beforehand. And that changes a lot of how the negotiation can go at the local level, but also between countries. In terms of measurements, so the reference level is one source of uncertainty. The other source of uncertainty is having the carbon measurements, but technology like satellite images, biological measurements have allowed to improve that a lot. But I think the main issue continues to be the political commitment, both from developing countries to enforce the right policies, but also from developed countries that perhaps hold on to the conditionality too much and want to compensate only after the effort and not before. Yeah, does that answer the question? Yeah.
Any other questions?
Yeah, thanks for the nice presentation. Yeah. I have a question about how to recover the forest, because I know if we just plant trees, it's just many trees, it's not forest.
Yeah.
So I mean, can you give us some the efficient way to recover the forest?
So if I understood correctly, it means that, so can we actually recover the forest, right? Like, yeah. It's not, yeah, and it's a very good point, and thank you for the question, and that allows me to highlight. Forests provide so many services, and they're very diverse. So they have more biodiversity, especially old growth forests. They have more biodiversity. They have more complexity that we wouldn't have in secondary forests, for example. So if we lose an old growth forest, secondary forests can regenerate and recuperate perhaps most of the properties of old growth forests, but there is this time lag in which we're not going to be able to recover immediately. And the other question is, like if we lose an old growth forest and we just plant fast growing trees, we might have more in terms of carbon capture, but we lose also the biodiversity and so it becomes a question of like perhaps almost a normative question of like, do you want to conserve the biodiversity or just care about the carbon stored in the utilitarian value of forest? Yeah.
Thank you very much. Here, there's another question.
Thank you for the presentation. And I agree that we need to enlarge the natural capital. And on the other side, I saw that there is humanity capital. And I think that probably the humanity capital can improve the natural capital. Like we can impose your concept into the educational system, and to make everybody agree that we have to improve our natural system. So, how do you think we can connect the natural capital with the humanity capital?
Yeah. I think there is some part of, like, we can replace some natural capital with human capital. And we have this golden rule in economics for sustainability, which is whatever you depreciate from your capital, you have to invest it again. So we might lose a forest, for example, but if we invest again in recovering a degraded area, then as long as we don't lose our natural capital base, then we're fine. Then the question, to which extent can human capital replace natural capital? It will really depend, I think, on the specific sector that you're analyzing. Like, it might be easier some sectors don't depend on natural capital that much. Let's think art, or so in that sense, it might be easy to replace, but in other areas, I think we definitely hit some constraints where we have to take care of our natural capital.
Thank you very much. Any other questions? So I guess my question has a little bit more to do with, we've talked about societal things we can do, global things we can do, but on an individual level, I'm seeing things like, okay, offset your air travel to this place with, this X amount of dollars that goes towards something. But what's kind of your thought from a scientific perspective on individual efforts like that?
Yeah. Nice. Thank you for all these questions. So I think individual effort is very important. So I would not discard it, and I have done it myself. Like, you try to compensate your emissions, and this is the best thing we can do, right? Like, and but there is also a problem. I don't want to deny it, that there is greenwashing. There's certifications that are not really. So in part of my PhD, I had to evaluate the RED Plus project, and the baseline was completely inflated, right? So the NGO, voluntarily or involuntarily, just inflated the deforestation so they would get more emissions reductions, but at the end, the capacity of the communities was not as high, like they could never have deforested so much. But it's changing this a lot. This is changing a lot among certification organizations, and also amongst the companies and organizations in voluntary carbon markets. So I do hope that in the future we can, like, there's more transparency and we can have more trust in those mechanisms, because I think they are very important and they should be part of our future green economy.
Thank you for that. I think we might have time for another question. There you go.
Hello, thanks for the presentation and sorry for walking in late. Just to be a bit provocative on your last point around offsets, right? I think we know that physical climate risks are getting worse. So, and I think it was last year or the year before, I think Microsoft had offset a whole bunch of emissions by planting forests, I think in the Pacific Northwest. All of those were on fire. The offsets are going up in smoke, literally.
Yeah.
So, how do you kind of think about that with respect to what you were saying about the importance of offsets?
Yeah, no, that's worrying. It's sort of like a good intention that didn't turn out, but I think, I mean, this just shows the difficulty in having proper carbon offsets. I mean, I would think, like, if it's so this emission wasn't the offset was in the US, right? They planted in the US. So I think a very important thing is really to think globally, and like the most valuable forests, I work on tropical forests, so I'm biased, but the most valuable forests, I think, are in developing areas because they have more diversity, they provide a lot more services. So I think there has to be this interest in big companies to invest in the areas and countries that need it the most and that can provide the cheapest offsets, I think. So that's one area, but also that's one point. But what you're also saying, I think it's related to this thing that I said, like we are reaching tipping points where even if we try to offset, there are things that are happening in the earth that are making the offsets or just reducing and mitigating our emissions even harder, right? So it's also pointing out to the need to act soon. Thank you for the question. Yeah, great audience. Thank you so much.
Presentation. So I think we can take a break before our next presentation. So 10-minute break. So you guys.
Let me go get that.
Before we get to our next presentation.
Yes.
I was just wondering because no one.
here for the next talk. So I would very much like to introduce our next speaker. So let me see, everything is ready. Yes. Our next speaker, Keith Lee. I would like to present him before he starts. So he is a senior analyst at CICERO, Shades of Green, where he works transparency around sustainable finance. His background experiences in investment banking, working for the WWF in East and Southeast Asia on sustainable finance, and he has a PhD in urban planning. Outside of work, he enjoys going for a run when he's not busy entertaining his 4-year-old son. So please welcome Keith here, and we are going to have an amazing presentation, I'm sure.
Hi, everyone. You can hear me okay, I presume. So thanks so much for sticking around to the last part of the evening and to hear my presentation. I'm used to going to presenting at conferences and then being in the last part of the itinerary, and then the room has 5 people left, at the end of the day. So this is really nice. So as the title says, I'm going to talk about a little bit about climate science and green finance, and hopefully, talk in an intelligible way about what I do. But to kind of start with some context setting, right? Where are we headed with climate change? So I don't know how familiar you are in this room. I'm sure there's probably climate science researchers who know a whole lot more about climate than I am sitting here. But essentially, right, the starting point is the Paris Agreement, where we have pretty much globally agreed to limit climate warming to well below 2 degrees, or ideally 1.5 degrees. And that's kind of the trajectory that's represented by the Paris Agreement. And is anyone in the audience who actually knows, what is the current level of climate warming above pre-industrial levels, like right now? Someone just shout it out. 1.8. Anyone? 1.2. Yeah. So it's around 1.2. And actually, I think the World Meteorological Office earlier this week just released a report saying that it's quite likely that within the next 3 or 4 years, we will probably exceed 1.5 degrees of warming momentarily, right? And that's not good. So we don't have a lot of time to try and bend the curve and bring down emissions. But what's kind of worrying also is that even with the Paris Agreement pledges, that is putting us on course for warming of about 2.7 to 2.9 degrees. So that's not great. And that level of warming, we're looking at something like 6 to 8 degrees warmer winters up here in Norway. That's obviously not good for the cross-country skiers among us. I hear my boss complaining about it all the time. He's a big cross-country skier. But obviously the worst news is that there's going to be a lot more physical climate impacts as a result of climate change. And again, I don't think this is something that I need to spend a lot of time on, but we're looking at more forest fires, more drought, sea level rise in the longer term, flooding, landslides, and then there's a whole lot of other impacts on biodiversity. Julia just now was talking about natural capital, right? There's a whole lot of other impacts on biodiversity that's also going to have a whole lot of physical risk implications for us. So this quote here on the slide is actually from the CEO of AXA, which is a big insurance company, basically saying that, with the kind of physical impacts from climate warming, there's no way that we can have any kind of insurance at 4 degrees. 2 degrees may be still okay. And that's because we have already started to see the effects of climate change, being felt in terms of damages to supply chains, in terms of damages to physical properties, disruptions to company operations, and so on and so forth. So that's kind of like what we think about as physical climate risks, right? And this is a big concern for financial institutions who are financing companies, So, if I'm a bank and I'm financing a farmer and, his farm is my collateral, what I'm holding in security, I'm going to be pretty worried if his farm is on fire, right? Because that's my collateral, like literally going up in flames. So that's physical climate risk. The other aspect of climate risk I want to talk about is something called transition risk, right? And that is that's the risks to businesses that result from the long-term changes in markets, in regulations, in technologies that come
from a transition to a low carbon economy. So this slide right here is produced by the International Energy Agency, and it's basically like a roadmap of what needs to happen if we are going to limit climate warming to 1.5 degrees. And that is associated with a milestone of net zero emissions by 2050, which I'm sure many of you have heard about. So you can see a lot of milestones here, probably some of which you might have heard about. Let's pick one, like no new internal combustion engine car sales by 2035. Phase out of all unabated coal and oil power plants by 2050, right? And actually IEA is not very good at modeling land use. So actually, if you included land use on here, you might have milestones like no more deforestation by 2030. That's also a key part of limiting climate warming to 1.5, right? But basically, the takeaway from all this is that if all these changes get implemented, that is going to create a complete change in the business environment for businesses. So if you're a business, you better be starting to think about how your business model is changing to adapt to all these different kinds of changes that are going to happen. So, if you're investing in car stocks, right? Are you going to invest in a car company that has no plans to produce electric vehicles? I don't think so, right? So that's kind of like a basic example of how financiers and investors are thinking about climate change impacting the companies that they're financing. So basically, you're looking at transition risk, you're looking at physical risks, and those kind of like two sides of a coin. Because if we fail to avert climate disaster, we're looking at physical risks, a whole lot of physical risks. But on the other hand, if we successfully limit climate warming to 1.5 degrees, we're looking at a whole bunch of transition risks, right? So either way, businesses and financial institutions, policymakers need to be thinking about the risks that climate change presents to businesses. Yeah. So the good news, though, is that it's not all about risks, right? So there needs to be a lot of new businesses, technologies that need to be financed in order to address the impacts of climate change, whether that's climate mitigation, whether that's climate adaptation. And we know that a lot of money is going to be needed there. But we also know that public sector money is not going to be nearly enough. So the government can, finance development of renewable energies, etc. But the private sector has to step up and has to step in order to provide the adequate amount of climate finance that we need. So this chart basically shows where we are with climate finance, in 2020, and where we actually need to be in 2021. And you can see there's a massive gap there. But that presents opportunities for investors. So right now we have investors who are looking to avoid climate risky investments. And we have investors who are also looking to finance the solutions, to take advantage of the opportunities presented by this transition. And so there's lots of different investment vehicles that they're using right now. So you probably have heard of venture capital, financing early stage companies. There's public-private sector collaborations, where governments kind of, provide some money to de-risk the investment and then bring in private investors. But then there's also green bonds. And green bonds have become like one of the biggest, instruments by which you're trying to channel money into financing, initiatives that address climate change adaptation and mitigation. So what is a green bond? Green bond is pretty similar to a standard bond. So let's talk about a standard bond or a vanilla bond first. And that's basically, a bond is basically a company going to some investors and saying, hey, can you lend me money? I need to build a factory, right? So then the investors say, okay, here's your money. And then the company takes the money, they build the factory, and then they return the money to the investors and they pay the investors some interest, right? So that's a vanilla bond. With a green bond, the company is telling the investors, look, I'm going to promise that I'm going to use your money that you lend me to do something good for the environment or to do something good for climate change. And so when they do that, the investor, is quite interested in that because, he wants to feel good. He wants to finance the climate transition. And he also wants to invest in something that's maybe a little bit less risky from a climate change point of view. But the problem is the company is telling the investors like, hey, I'm going to invest in this. And the investor's like, how do I know that what you are investing in is actually green? Or how do I know that you're going to, hold up your end of the bargain? And that's where the kind of this whole model of second-party opinions and external reviews steps comes in. And that's where, CICERO Shades of Green steps into the picture. Because what we've helped to do is help to pioneer this model of external reviews. So what we do is we produce second opinions, and the idea is to protect the integrity of the green bond market. So in a case where the issuer wants to issue a green bond, the standard practice nowadays is to develop what's called a green bond framework. And that framework lists the kind of projects that they want to invest in. So they might say, oh, we want to use some money for solar plants, we want to use some money to invest in sustainable agriculture, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then what we do is we look at that framework, and we ask the company a whole bunch of tough questions, and basically write up a report that identifies, it kind of validates the environmental credentials of the investment. At the same time, it also highlights what kind of risks the investment is exposed to. Because even if it is a green investment, it's still exposed to it's still exposed to transition climate risks, right? So if you think about a solar power plant that's being built on the coast of Vietnam, I don't know if that's such a good idea given what we know about sea level rise and extreme weather. So this is our company. We are a subsidiary of the Center for International Climate Research. My office is at Forskningsparken. And CICERO, the research center, has been contributing to IPCC since 1992. So there's a lot of heritage, a lot of expertise on climate science. And the way this second party opinion model started was to basically, with the World Bank's first ever green bond, where CICERO researchers were asked to provide the second party opinion. And since then, we've grown into quite a large commercial entity. We've worked with a lot of household names, some of which you're probably familiar with, in terms of giving a second opinion on their green bond. So we are very focused on translating climate science, what I was talking about with IEA, climate scenarios, etc. Taking that climate science and climate scenario knowledge and distilling that into a rating system that investors can quite easily understand, but which is at the same time which is sophisticated enough to kind of reflect all the nuances associated with climate investments. So this is where we take our name from. We have the shades of green. We also have a yellow and red shading. But basically, the dark green shading, or you can think of this shading as like how future-proof is the investment. So a dark green investment, that's investment in something that we know we will need in 2050, because that, a 2050 low carbon and climate resilient future. Whereas a light green investment is something that delivers emissions reductions maybe in the shorter term, but at the end of the day doesn't have a place in that longer term vision, right? And then yellow is kind of like business as usual kind of things that don't really, impact or really hinder the transition. And then red is stuff that we just have to stop. So, new fossil fuel production, deforestation linked activities, etc. So we basically apply these shadings, and we apply them in our ratings of companies, and then investors kind of look at that and make a decision as to whether to invest in the green bond or not. And maybe just spend a minute on this guy. So this guy's Mark Carney. He's kind of a superstar in the world of sustainable finance. He's the former governor of the Bank of England. And we love this quote because he talks about how we need to think about investments in different shades of green. And for him, 50 shades of green. But obviously that's really good for us because it just reflects the fact that we need a nuanced approach to thinking about what is green and what is not. Some of you may have heard of the EU taxonomy regulation, where they're basically classifying activities into sustainable or not. From our perspective, that's not nuanced enough. We need a bit more nuance to help investors understand more. How much time do I have left? I'm okay. Okay, thanks. So just to kind of illustrate with maybe one or two examples, right? What is a green ship? So the shipping sector is really interesting because right now there are no solutions for net zero shipping. At least not for net zero, deep ocean kind of shipping, the stuff that you see containers crossing the Pacific Ocean, going to Japan and Korea and so on. And that's because right now the fuels are things like heavy fuel oil, diesel, and there's no way to be able to kind of power the ship when it's out at sea for weeks on end. Solar power and wind power are certainly not there. So when we're looking at green bond investments from the shipping sector, there's all kinds of different technologies that are being proposed now to try and decarbonize that are less emissions intensive than burning diesel and so on. So one of the things that's being proposed is LNG, liquefied natural gas. So that is it's a cleaner fuel than diesel. But if you think about the fact, if you recall that IEA graph, we need to be phasing out new oil and gas investments pretty quickly. So in the grand scheme of things, is investing in an LNG ship really a long-term solution? Probably not, even though it delivers short-term emissions reductions, right? So in some cases, maybe that qualifies for a light green shading, but again, it's really, really context specific. Another technology is hydrogen. Now, hydrogen is great. We can burn it and it's only going to release water vapor. But where does the hydrogen come from, right? So when we think about these things, we're thinking about the supply chain, we're thinking about the life cycle impact. So with hydrogen, you can make it from methane in a process called steam reformation, but that's still dependent on methane, right? And methane is just natural gas. So at the end of the day, you're kind of back at square one in terms of fossil fuel dependency. So when we look at hydrogen, ideally we want green hydrogen that's produced from electrolysis of water using renewable electricity. But then, to kind of take things one step further and maybe depress all of you a little bit more, where is that water going to come from? Water, people say that climate change is, well, what's the quote? Climate change is the shark and water is the teeth, right? So if you're in, really water and kind of water deprived areas and you want to produce green hydrogen, not sure if that's a good idea either. So that's why we always look at the physical risk and the transition risk of the investment together. So the last part, which I think is really interesting also, is even if you sorted out the fuel technology, what's the kind of cargo that you're hauling around, right? So you might have a fully decarbonized oil tanker, but is that considered green? Or maybe you have a fully decarbonized cruise ship, but you have a whole bunch of people there, indulging in consumption, using a lot of energy, using a lot of water, generating a lot of waste. Maybe that's not particularly green either. So we also think about what actually is the technology being deployed for, and what is the actual end use as well when we think about the shade of green that we're assigning. Next example, what is a green building? So I don't read Norwegian, but someone tells me that this says that, I think, like green bonds and I think something about very bad greenwashing in Norway. But it's got to do with the building sector. And that's because, again, it's a complex kind of sector. So a lot of people will look at the building certification scheme and say, oh, that's great. They've got a LEED platinum or something like that. But what people don't realize is that certification schemes oftentimes don't necessarily guarantee a level of energy efficiency which future-proofs the building. Because you have buildings which have useful lifetimes of something like 50 years. And if that's the case, if you're building a new building right now, that building pretty much has to be net zero already today in order to be aligned with our low carbon and climate resilient 2050 vision. So that's why when we look at buildings, we always look at whether the energy efficiency performance exceeds new building regulations right now and to what extent that is the case. Then coming back to the physical climate risks, we're always looking at hazards, flooding, fire. I think if you went to your, for those of you who are property owners, if you went to your mortgage provider and asked them, hey, what percentage of your mortgage portfolio is exposed to flooding risk? I don't think they could tell you, right? They don't know. So that's another thing you have to think about when you're buying real estate, right? If you want to own for the next 100 years, don't buy on a coastline. And then, even if you sorted out the building emissions from the use phase, there's the construction phase to think about as well, right? So in Norway, apparently some 10% of emissions are embedded in the materials for building construction. So we know that cement is a very, very emissions intensive material to produce. So is steel. Wood, maybe less, but is that wood grown sustainably? Is it harvested sustainably? Does it come at the expense of natural capital and biodiversity loss? So again, those are questions that we would ask. And then also thinking about kind of systemic issues, right? The transportation solutions. Is it connected to public transport? Are there bike racks, etc. So again, you can kind of see the complexity of the assessments that we're thinking about. Last slide, just to talk about how we feel we've made a difference. This was an interesting case with Greek seafood. They're aquaculture. They produce salmon, and they wanted to raise a green bond. And they told us that part of the proceeds will be used to buy the food for feeding their salmon. Now, overall, they had I think they had certifications from the Aquaculture Stewardship Council and a lot of best practices on the actual salmon farming itself. But the feed is problematic because it contains a lot of soy, and a lot of that is from Brazil, and a lot of that is associated with deforestation. So Greek was already sourcing certified soy but there's certain limitations with certification schemes that don't necessarily, eliminate the risk of deforestation. So we're basically telling them like, look, there is still going to be a risk of deforestation in your feed, and this is going to affect the shading we give you. And they came back and told us, okay, we're going to exclude, we're not going to buy feed from Cargill, which at the time was being kind of, had a lot of focus on it because of links with deforestation in Brazil. So their green bond framework actually said, we will not buy feed from Cargill. And this actually came out in the Financial Times as a very kind of clear market signal to Cargill that you better get your act better get your act together and address deforestation. Otherwise, you're going to be losing out on people not wanting to buy your soy. And so for us, that was obviously quite a positive outcome. Obviously, it's not a silver bullet. There's obviously many issues that remain unresolved. But yeah, nice to have a positive story here and there, I guess. So thanks very much for listening, and looking forward to questions.
Thank you very much for that talk. Are there any questions that you guys would like to address to Keith? Any questions here?
Yeah, thanks for the presentation. Because just now you mentioned what's the green shade, right? You said now there's no zero emission shade, right? But I was wondering, I think the U.S. Navy has some aircraft, the carrier is driven by the nuclear power. So probably it means now we have this kind of technology, but it's not used in the civilized level. I'm not sure if it's correct or.
Thanks for that question. And actually, I'm glad you mentioned that, because it's someone never on our radar that there's nuclear-powered aircraft carriers out there. But you're right. It's not really being used by civilian operations right now. I think if a ship company came to us and said that they did want to produce a nuclear-powered vessel and use green bonds to finance that, it's not something that we would reject outright. Obviously, everything is very context dependent. We've actually done green bond second opinions for nuclear power producers, and that's because given the urgency of climate action, nuclear does have a part to play in decarbonization, and ultimately that's controversial, right, because of waste issues and risks. But because of unresolved kind of issues around the waste management, it would never qualify for a dark green shading from us. So the nuclear power producers that we rated both got medium green shadings, and the other kinds of things we looked at, were like where they're sourcing uranium from, what are the supply chain policies and governance look like, in order for them to be able to get that rating. But yeah, it's a good question.
Any other questions? Yes.
Thank you very much for the interesting presentation. I really enjoyed it. I guess my question is how subjective or objective this differentiated green are. I mean, you assess a project, do you think you get the same result, either in CICERO doing it or different scheme?
Thanks. So because the methodologies used by different second-party opinion providers are all different, you would probably get different considerations. But within our own work, I would say we strive to be internally consistent. If I go back to the shades, actually. So I talked. My title of the talk is climate science and green finance, and the reason for that is because what we classify as dark green is based on what we know about needing to be net zero by 2050. So if we look at dark green, wherever in the world you go, dark green is dark green. Net zero is net zero. Zero emissions is zero emissions. But when we look at the light green space, that's where there is some room for more subjectivity and to take into account the specific context that the companies are in. So we're thinking about a company that wants to finance, a car company that wants to finance hybrid vehicles and sell them in Norway. I'm not even sure that would kind of qualify for a shade of green, given what is the penetration of battery electric vehicles in Norway already. But if that company were doing the same thing in Indonesia, that might be different. So that's kind of like how we reflect local context and take into account specific situations, and that's where subjectivity can come in. But we think it's very important to reflect context and nuance, because investors are looking for that. They don't want to just see a rating. You know, the kind of most advanced investors are actually thinking very deeply about the companies that they're investing in, and the kinds of nuances and contextual information that we provide is often very valued.
Hi, thanks for your talk. It was really interesting. I was wondering, do you have, like you mentioned the EU taxonomy, and that has the do no significant harm principle embedded in it. Do you also use that for your shading?
Yeah, so when we assess the shading, you know, the focus is on climate change primarily, but we are aware of interlinkages between climate and biodiversity, interlinkages with water, social issues as well. So if there are, like, you know, significant risk of social controversies arising from the company, that's something that we will flag. Other kinds of issues pertaining to water and biodiversity loss, we do try and fit it into the shading as best as we can, but it's not as systematic as we would like it to be. So we're continually trying to refine the methodology to be able to address other kinds of non-climate environmental issues. And in that sense, you know, that's how we're kind of incorporating the do no significant harm criteria into what we're doing. But then specifically on EU taxonomy, if the company asks us to assess alignment against the EU taxonomy, then we would look very explicitly at the do no significant harm criteria.
Yeah, thank you. So you mentioned that EU shading is related to the context. I was wondering, how do they evolve based on time and science? So for instance, is hybrid can be in 10 years already? And how do you take into account the lag between discovery and implementation on development? How will that be taken into account?
Yeah. Sorry, what was the example that you gave me? Something in 10 years might be red. Oh, hybrid costs, yeah.
In 10 years is red.
Yeah, maybe. But you're right. You know, that's why I think it's so important that we're situated within the Climate Research Center. You know, and every time a new IPCC report comes out, every time there's new findings, we have to try and be in dialogue with that. So you're absolutely right. It's a great point that, you know, nothing is static. We're trying to take a science-based perspective on things. And if there's new findings that come out, then we have to think about that. So one of the things, like, is with hydrogen. Like right now, we know that hydrogen can generate lots of emissions reductions because it doesn't release CO2 when you combust it. But at the same time, there's also ongoing research into the impacts of a large-scale hydrogen economy on climate, because inevitably you're going to have certain amounts of leaked hydrogen, right? So what does that mean if you have more hydrogen being concentrated in the atmosphere because we're scaling up hydrogen production and storage so much? So right now, that's something that we're keeping an eye on. But also, given the kind of the urgency of addressing climate change, we also can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good as well, and we have to be kind of practical. Otherwise, if we kind of highlight every kind of like tiny little issue or the prospect for something to become an issue in the future, maybe investors or companies would not act at all. So, but yeah, it's at the end of the day, we try and stay on top of the developments.
Yeah, thank you for the talk. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the business model, like just to make sure, because I guess in those type of certifications you can get some greenwashing, so like who are your clients, who are your financiers, and have you seen some changes recently in your type of clients?
Yeah, tough question and a good question. So we are, our clients are the issuers that we work with. So when a company wants to issue a green bond, it comes to us and it says, "Can you do our second party opinion?" Now, on the surface, that doesn't look great, right? Because of conflict of interest potential. And I recognize that that is kind of like overall limitation with this kind of second party opinion model in the green bond market, because even if our company has manages to avoid conflict of interest issues perfectly, there is very much, the market's kind of set up for like a race to the bottom among second party opinion providers. So I guess I can't really comment on that too much, other than to say that banks, investors, companies, they are aware that there is a difference in the quality of second-party opinions and that some are tougher than others. As for ourselves, I think we don't necessarily have like specific KPIs, and I think being part of the research institute and not being beholden to shareholders to grow, to be profitable is also firstly a big benefit. And then secondly, if something is not green, we will tell the company that it's not green. And there are cases where companies enter into contracts with us. We go through and we produce a report for them. They don't like the outcome, and then they decide not to issue a green bond. Or if they come to us and then we see the kind of framework, we'll tell them upfront if we think there are issues. And what people don't realize is that, at least for us, there is an engagement process that goes on with the company, whereby they might come to us with their green bond framework, but then by the end of the process, they've made adjustments to the green bond framework in order to qualify for a label from us.
Are there any other questions? Thank you for the good presentation. And about the shading, I'm curious, like because if you want to produce a product or, for example, a building material, like you have it under the supply chain, it has a lot of like outsourcing issue. When you are doing the shading, are you based on only the document like provided by manufacturing or the technology owner, or you actually go there to do the inspection? For example, like I watched a documentary about like all the shipping industry. Even though they have a documentary documents showing that they do their water, they fill out the water and doesn't really take the water out, dirty water out of the ocean, but they still do it during a bad weather or during the night and so on. But this type of thing is not like documented, but it's never like inspection, like a mechanism to do like auditing.
So we're not an auditor. So we don't do site visits. We don't visit factories, that kind of thing. So it's very much desk research, and we are looking at the policies of the company, how they're engaging with suppliers. What is their own policies and procedures for internal audits, safeguards, things like that. And I recognize that is a limitation, absolutely. But there are other watchdogs out there to kind of play that role in terms of spotting the company that's deforesting when it has a no deforestation policy.
Okay, so do we have any more questions before we wrap up? No? Okay, so I would like to thank you again. Thank you very much. Okay, so thank you so much for coming. Before you guys go and have another beer and continue chatting with your friends, I would like to mention that we're having another the third night of Applied Science here. Again, here where you are right now. So please come tomorrow. We're going to be here with more really